The Casa Feliz Parlor series is a sequence of lectures and performances and owes its name to the house's historic reputation as Winter Park's Parlor. Mr. and Mrs. Robert Bruce Barber, the original owners of the home, were heavily involved in cultural organizations and frequently opened their doors to the community. Tonight is our second venture into virtual programming, and we are grateful to our partners at the library. Join us next month on Tuesday, March 23rd for The Next Generation, Building on the Legacy of James Gamble Rogers II, presented by Gamble Rogers' son, Jack Rogers. Jack will discuss memories of his father, who was a noted architect of many prominent homes and other buildings in Central Florida, including, of course, Casa Feliz. He will also review other architecture in Central Florida, some of which may have been inspired by James Gamble Rogers II. But tonight, Jonathan Rich will describe the defining features of the uniquely American vernacular Carpenter Gothic style of architecture and recount how it's brought to the Florida frontier. His presentation will be accompanied by the photography of Casa Feliz board member Phil Eschbach. Jonathan and Phil are completing a forthcoming book on Florida's surviving Carpenter Gothic Episcopal churches of the 1800s. Please welcome from our parlor to your parlor, Jonathan Rich and Phil Eschbach.
Thank you, Rick. This is Jonathan Rich. Thank you for joining us tonight. As Rick said, we have been working for some time on a book. I've done the text and Phil has done the images. It's currently in the hands of an independent New York editor, and we plan to present it to publishing houses later this year. We'll be looking at Phil's pictures tonight, and I'll be talking about the churches, and then we'll have some time to answer your questions. As we start with the images, I'll provide a little background on where this style of church came from and how it got to Florida. The first image that we'll see is a portrait of Richard Upjohn. Richard Upjohn was a famous architect of the American Gothic revival, a period in the 1800s when medieval architectural forms from the high and late Middle Ages, the 12th through the 16th centuries, were revived, first in England, then in America. Upjohn was born in England. He became a cabinet maker, and then he immigrated as a young man with his wife and first child to America, where he became an architect because he decided he could be one. At that time, neither a special education nor licensing was required to be an architect. He turned out to be pretty successful. He was a member of the Church of England, therefore an Anglican, and so he became an Episcopalian in the US. As a quick aside, the Episcopal Church, for those who don't know, is the American descendant of the English churches that were effectively stranded here after America won the Revolution. Essentially, what had been English churches in an English colony got together after the Revolution in 1789 and formed a new American, but very similar version of the Church of England, calling it the Episcopal Church. Now for tonight, there are three things we'll want to know about Richard Upjohn. The first is that he designed Trinity Church in Manhattan, which was built from 1839 to 1846. The church is often photographed at the end of Wall Street with a very tall spire. It was the tallest building in America for many years and was the tallest building in Manhattan until the Empire State Building was built. Trinity Church was hailed immediately as the apotheosis of the American Gothic revival, and it made Upjohn famous. The second thing we want to know about Upjohn is that in 1857, he gathered 13 New York City architects in his offices to found the American Institute of Architects, and he became that institute's first president. And the third thing we need to know, and the most important for tonight, is that Upjohn designed simple but beautiful Gothic wooden churches for Episcopal missions or small parishes in rural areas. Typically, these small Episcopal congregations had little money to pay his fee, so he donated his services to at least one congregation per year. But that led to even greater demand for his work, as congregations vied to be the one that would get his designs for free. Eventually, he solved that problem by publishing a so-called pattern book, a large format book that contained the plans and specifications for a church, a chapel, a rectory, and a schoolhouse. It was titled Upjohn's Rural Architecture, and Upjohn said that using it, any competent builder or master carpenter would be able to produce the buildings presented in his book. Now, this is a good place to point out that Richard Upjohn was not the only American architect to use the Carpenter Gothic idiom for residences and for churches. There were also pattern books other than Upjohn's, including a number that had designs for churches. But Upjohn's was the most popular and influential book, particularly within the Episcopal Church, because his designs were considered beautiful and ecclesiologically correct expressions of Gothic revival principles. Ecclesiology at that time was an academic discipline, a study devoted to determining the highest and best in Gothic church architecture and church furnishings. Both England and the United States had ecclesiological societies that published journals, including critiques of architecture, and the opinions of those societies were very influential within the Church of England and the Episcopal Church. Now, Upjohn and the other architects that I've mentioned originated the Carpenter Gothic style first in the eastern US, later spreading to other regions as they began to express Gothic revival ideas in wood instead of stone. That change from stone to wood was the foundational aspect of the architectural style. The style gained popularity for churches on the American frontier and in rural areas from about 1850 to about 1910. One reason for its popularity was that on the American frontier, wood was plentiful and cheap, whereas stone and brick were often harder to come by and always harder to transport. The Carpenter Gothic style is uniquely American. It's not found anywhere else in the world. Wooden churches, yes, of course, but not this kind. I've already said that it was an American expression of Gothic revival principles in wood, but more specifically, to drill down on that, it arose as a translation from stone into wood of the small parish churches of the English countryside, churches that were popularized by Augustus Pugin and others during the English Gothic revival of the 1800s. Those little stone parish churches in England, in turn, were based on forms that had been expressed half a millennium earlier in the medieval Gothic cathedrals of England and France. Thus, in a very real sense, Carpenter Gothic Episcopal churches in Florida and elsewhere can be thought of as tiny, simplified, wooden descendants of the great Gothic cathedrals. Now, you may wonder how many Carpenter Gothic Episcopal churches there are in Florida that survive in near to original form. And the answer to that is about 40. There's some subjectivity, of course, in that determination. 38 are featured in our book. We'll concentrate on 6 of them tonight. Now, the next image that we'll see after Richard Upjohn is the model church from Richard Upjohn's pattern book. You'll see the similarities between it and the Florida churches that are coming up. But while we're here, let's go over the defining features of the style. First, there's the basic shape and massing. These churches are small, often only about 40 feet long and 20 feet wide. Also, they're very narrow, yet they're quite tall for their small size. Finally, their roofs are steeply pitched and gabled. With the resulting shape overall, they convey pointedness. They're like an arrow or a finger pointing to heaven. And that's not unintentional symbolism. In fact, nothing in Christian ecclesiastical architecture is accidental. Let's look at some of the other elements. The walls, as you can see, have board and batten siding. Usually, as in Upjohn's model here, the boards and the battens are vertically aligned. The windows are so-called lancet windows because they are lance-like. They're narrow, they come to an arched top, as in the Upjohn model here, or they're straight-edged and pointed at the top. We'll see both tonight in Phil's photographs. And of course, the windows are filled with stained glass. Other characteristics of the style is that inside, and you can't see it here, of course, there are open ceilings with scissor trusses, and sometimes there is a bell tower, as there is here, and that is usually asymmetrically positioned. You'll see that this bell tower is on one side of the church rather than centrally located. And of course, the bell tower often has a steeple. So now the question is, how did Upjohn's designs get to Florida? Well, for one, in the mid-1800s, Florida, particularly the peninsula, was the East Coast's last frontier. It was the final frontier of the East Coast of the United States. So as a region, it was well suited to the style. And all that was needed was a prime mover to bring it here, which takes us to the next image. And that image is of John Freeman Young. Traveling Episcopal priests and missionaries all played a role in bringing the style to Florida, but the prime mover was John Freeman Young. In 1867, at the age of 47, after serving as a missionary Episcopal priest in Florida, Texas, Mississippi, and Louisiana, then serving for 12 years at Trinity Church, the same one as designed by Upjohn in Manhattan, where he got to work directly with Upjohn, John Freeman Young was appointed as the Episcopal Church's second bishop of Florida. In Florida, he traveled by horseback, horse-drawn cart, steamboat, and small boat to visit small congregations, organize them into missions, and help them build churches. During his travels, Bishop Young carried Upjohn's pattern book, or plans of churches influenced by the book. He gave the plans to the missions he helped to form, so the churches they built reflected the Upjohn style. The result was that about 100 or more churches, I would say as many as 120 if you count private chapels, were built in the so-called Upjohn style in Florida during Young's episcopate and the episcopate of his successors, Bishop Edwin Garner Weed and Bishop Gray for the Southern District of Florida, which was originally a mission and then a diocese in its own right. Well, wait just a minute. Some of you are saying if there were over 100 churches originally, and you said about 40 remain in pretty good semblance of their original condition, what happened to the rest? The short answer to that is that many were modified. A good example is St. Mark's in Cocoa, which was given a Mediterranean revival exterior. A good number of them were destroyed by fire. One was burned by Union soldiers during the Civil War. One was destroyed up in Warrington near Pensacola. It was destroyed by a shell fired across the mouth of Pensacola Bay by Union soldiers from Fort Pickens. Quite a few were destroyed by hurricanes. Some were demolished, not too many, I'm relieved to say. And when that happened, their parts were usually saved and the wood was used for other purposes. That's what happened to the original All Saints in Winter Park. And it was replaced by the present structure, which was designed by Ralph Adams Cram. Okay, let's look at some of the Florida churches, which will take us to the next image. This image is of St. Mary's Episcopal Church. All these churches are Episcopal churches in Green Cove Springs. Green Cove Springs is on the St. Johns River, which you see in the background, midway between Palatka and Jacksonville. The town rose up around a spring by the same name, reaching a heyday as a resort for Northerners in the 1870s, when it was referred to as the Saratoga of the South. It had wood frame luxury hotels that fronted the spring, boardwalks down to the spring, and the spring's flow was channeled into swimming pools. Visiting tourists from the north took the waters. They swam in the pools, they drank the water with their meals. Some stayed or at least built winter cottages and returned in the winter. Bishop Young raised $1,000 in Green Cove Springs in 1 week in 1879 among local Episcopalians who were hotel guests or seasonal residents. In relative project worth, that might be like raising about $250,000 today. A man named Thaddeus Davids, who was an ink tycoon from New York City, donated a lot for the church. And the church was built by James McGuire, who was a 6'6" former shipbuilder who built all of Henry Flagler's hotels, plus the Seminole Hotel on Lake Osceola here in Winter Park, which many of you will remember because it still stood in our lifetimes. McGuire also built the Church of the Good Shepherd in Maitland, which we'll be seeing in a minute. Let's take a closer look at this image. First, of course, you can see the semblance to the Upjohn Model Church. But second, I'll point out that this church represents the high end of the Carpenter Gothic spectrum. By that I mean it's larger, it's more finished, more stylized, it has a tower, and it has a steeple, which a good many of the churches in Florida do not. Also inside it has plastered walls, which quite a few of the Florida churches don't. Next, I'll invite your attention to the characteristically shaped stained glass lancet windows. You'll see others a little bit better in some upcoming images. But if you look closely, you'll also see that this church has a special feature. It's found on some of the churches, but not many. If you look closely, you'll see hatch-like panels under the windows on the left wall. These are ventilation panels. We'll see a close-up of them in a moment. These panels had hinged doors which were opened on warm days to allow cross breezes to flow through the church as a kind of air conditioning of their time. Next, you can see that the church is elevated on brick piers, as all the Florida churches were, to avoid moisture and insects from direct contact with the soil. The piers also helped with the flooding. Of all the churches in our book, this one lies the closest to the water. It was flooded up to its floorboards after Hurricane Irma engorged the St. John's in 2017. The piers served their purpose. There was very little damage to the church. The last feature we'll look at on this image is the battens on the walls, which you can see on the facing wall. Those battens, again, are the thin strips of wood that cover the cracks between the wall boards. But these battens are relatively rare because of their shape. They're a little far away to see, but if you could see them closely, and better, if you could see them in cross-section, you would see that they are not rectangular like most battens, but instead are triangular. Triangular or three-sided battens are an aesthetic variation found primarily on the St. John's, but also in a few other of the Florida churches. We discuss them in some detail in the book. Next, we'll look at a period photo, which is in black and white. And that you will see has 1870 at the bottom. That's an error from the Florida Memory website. This photograph is not that old. But the photograph shows the remarkable degree of preservation of the original appearance of the church. It does look a little different, but that's because it's taken from the opposite side of the church, from the perspective used by Phil with his photo. While we're here, I'll mention that this church follows Upjohn lines, which you can see, but it was designed actually by Charles Haight, an acclaimed Gothic revival architect who designed Episcopal churches in New York and buildings at Yale University. Bishop Young knew Charles Haight through Haight's father and directly asked him to design this church. The next image is again one of Phil's, and it's from the interior. It shows the windows tilted open and the ventilation panels open. Here you can see that the windows tilted open on a central horizontal pin. Virtually all the stained glass windows in the Florida churches and other similar churches in other states opened that way at that time. St. Mary's has the distinction of being the only Carpenter Gothic Episcopal church left in Florida, at least, that has windows and ventilation panels that are fully functional and can still be opened in the original manner. The next image shows the church's altar triptych window, and here we see images of faith, hope, and charity, the 2nd century saints, daughters of Saint Sophia, who were named for the 3 theological virtues cited by St. Paul in 1 Corinthians 13. Charity is sometimes referred to as love, and she, representing the greatest of the 3 virtues, is given the central position in this triptych. These windows were made by Edward Colgate, who had a well-known studio in New York City. You might have a little difficulty seeing the symbols at the tops of the windows, but I'll describe them for you. Starting on the left side, I think you can see a bird-like figure. It's there, the cursor, this would be on the left, and it's there. Yes, thank you. That's a phoenix, the mythological bird reborn from its fiery ashes. The phoenix was used as a Christian symbol of the resurrection. Next, in the center at the same level, is a pelican, which is pecking its own breast. Again, that's hard to see in this size. Pelicans do that to gather feathers and down to line their nests, but they sometimes can so irritate their chests to the point of bleeding, so that in medieval times, the bird was thought to be feeding its young with its own flesh. So it became a Christian symbol for self-sacrifice in nourishing others spiritually. The last symbol at the same level on the right is a descending dove. In the Gospels, John the Baptist says that after Jesus rose from being baptized in the Jordan River, he saw the Holy Spirit descending on him like a dove. So the dove is a very frequently used symbol of the Holy Spirit and is usually depicted as descending. The next image is an interior shot, and it is facing toward the chancel, again, of the same church, St. Mary's in Green Cove Springs. The chancel is the holiest part of the church, set apart from the main body of the building, or the nave, where the congregation sits. Here you can see the extensive use of wood on the interior, which is characteristic of the genre. But again, in this church, representing the high end of the style, the walls are plastered, which I mentioned before. In many of the Florida churches, and I'll give examples now, All Saints in Enterprise, or St. Luke's in Courtney over on Merritt Island, the walls are left bare. So you actually see the boards and the posts and the studs of the carpentry. Now the next image will take us to the next church. And it is St. Margaret's at Hibernia on Fleming Island. This is a favorite of many people. This church was built in 1875 by Margaret Seton Fleming, and she built it in close coordination with Bishop Young, who actually had to finish it because she fell into poor health at the end, and actually her funeral was the first service held in the church. Margaret Seton Fleming, after her husband Lewis's death, became the head of the much storied Fleming family, which owned much of Fleming Island on the St. Johns River from the Second Spanish period through the Seminole Wars, the Civil War, right up to World War II. Fleming Island, by the way, is located slightly north of Green Cove Springs. The Fleming family's period of greatest renown was during the steamboat era, when their large house on the river became a famous destination as a boarding house for tourists and travelers. Notice how small this church is. It seats only 80 people if they're squeezed tight. It's shorter and seats fewer people than an Amtrak train car. It's the smallest of the Florida churches and one of the oldest. Also, it's a good example of the simpler end of the Carpenter Gothic spectrum. In that sense, it's at the opposite end of the more stylized, elaborate St. Mary's. But it's strongly characteristic of the style nonetheless. You can see that it has a steeply pitched roof. You can see its narrowness. You can see its vertically aligned boards and battens, and its lancet windows with true Gothic curved arches at the tops. We'll now go to a 1910 photograph, which of course will be black and white. And that shows the same church from the side. And again, this shows the near complete state of this church's preservation. There are a few differences from today that we can single out. One of them is that the roof here, back in the day, is still covered in cypress or possibly cedar shingles, as all the church's roofs were originally. Later, they were replaced with metal roofs or modern architectural shingles. You'll also notice there's a fence of wood and wire in front of the church, and that is to keep out wandering pigs. Pigs were very fond of getting under these churches because they were conveniently elevated, and the pigs would like to loll in the shade underneath, and that was thought unseemly, and so it was prevented by the erection of fences. Now, you'll notice if you look closely that the window furthest to the left looks a little different from the three other windows, four actually, that you can see. Those other windows are darker. Now, the reason for that is that the window on the far left is filled with figurative stained glass. In fact, we're going to see a detail of it from the interior in a minute. The other windows, the dark ones, are simple diamond lattice work with colored panes. In a common progression, less expensive, simple but decorative windows were used first until donations were made of more costly, elaborate, figurative stained glass windows, often as memorials to loved ones. And that's exactly what you see with that last one. All but one of the churches in this church over time were replaced with those memorial types of windows. The next image is from inside, and again, of course, all the color photographs that we're seeing are fills. This one shows the chancel and the altar. The altar window, again, a triptych, was a memorial to Margaret Seton Fleming, and it was installed shortly after her death and was donated by her family. Its theme is night. You can see that the window on the far left is somewhat dark. It has stars, if you could see it up close, and the window on the far right represents day. And that theme was chosen partly to symbolize the rhythms out in natural Florida, of life on the Florida frontier. This window was made in 1880 by a well-known glass artisan, James Baker, in New York City. The next slide shows a window detail from the same church with a depiction of the celebrated Fleming house. Again, a popular tourist destination during the 1800s. The Fleming family called it the Big House. Commercially, it was known as the Fleming Inn, but those in the know simply referred to it as Mrs. Fleming's. Very famous for its Lady Baltimore cake, for its dances, the Virginia Reel by moonlight under the oaks, for picnicking and sailing, hunting, fishing during the day, carriage rides. This window, I should point out, is a contemporary window. It's very nice. It's one of several from the 1970s and 1980s, but we chose it because it shows the the Fleming in. The next photograph is a period window. This one was the one you saw from outside a moment ago, one of the first figurative windows installed in the church. This one is very important. It was made by David Maitland Armstrong. David Maitland Armstrong was the leading artisan of Tiffany Studios during some of that studio's most celebrated years. David Maitland Armstrong was a noted American painter as well, and a diplomat too. And he was a contemporary and considered the equal of many of the great creators of the age: Augustus St. Gaudens, Tiffany himself, and the architects Richard Morris Hunt, Charles F. McKim, and Stanford White. David Maitland Armstrong made this window, which stands on a remote lane in the Florida backwoods today, as a memorial to his brother, whose name was Gouverneur Armstrong. Gouverneur Armstrong was a friend of the Flemings. He kept a house on Fleming Island, and he was the first treasurer of St. Margaret's Church. This is a beautiful and priceless window. Although it's from the 1880s, it anticipates modernism, as you can see, in its simplicity and abstractness. Also, it features the layering and opalescence, particularly in the dove wings, that is often characteristic of the Tiffany style, which David Maitland Armstrong helped pioneer for the Tiffany studio. Now, the next photo will take us to another church. And that church is Grace Church in Port Orange, which, to refresh your memory, lies between New Smyrna Beach and Daytona Beach. This church was built in 1893. Notice the variations on the Upjohn style. Those include the fish scale siding, which you can see up in the tower and at the gable, and also the horizontal lap siding. I'll point out the red door. Red doors are common on Episcopal churches and some other churches. Red doors are rich in multiple symbolism, and I don't have time to get into all of that, but I'll give one instance. The red recalls the instruction given to the Jewish people to mark their doors with a sacrificed lamb's red blood during the original Passover to protect their firstborn from the angel of death, which of course slaughtered the firstborn among the Egyptians. Thus, red signifies the church as a place of protection or salvation. The next slide is one of two Tiffany windows at Grace Church. This large window shows St. Luke, the physician evangelist, haloed and holding his gospel. He's usually portrayed that way. This window was commissioned by church member Mary Meeker to memorialize her husband, Charles Meeker, who was a physician. The Meekers were longtime supporters of Grace Church. For Tiffany enthusiasts, and we may have some in this audience, there are two interesting facts about this window. One is that it's the only known depiction of St. Luke ever made by Tiffany. And the other is that Tiffany windows were not often signed, but this one is signed, as we'll see in a detail in a moment. But first, let's go to the next image, which is the church's second Tiffany window. This one, which is the altar window, is magnificent. It's even larger than the other. Again, you can see that Tiffany is taking us further toward abstraction. You see that in the flanking windows, where you have a sunset-like theme. And of course, the central window portrays Christ as the Good Shepherd. This window happens to face west, toward a stand of trees. In the afternoon, when a breeze moves the tree branches, the resulting filtered light dances across the window and seems to animate it. It's quite a quite a sight to see. The next image, of course, is the Tiffany Studios signature on the St. Luke window. And the next photograph of the same church is the interior, taken in the nave, facing the chancel. This one shows quite a bit of the nave. It shows the church's so-called expressed or budding chancel. And by that we mean a chancel with narrower walls, I think you can see that, and a lower roof than the nave. So it appears to bud out from the main building. Also, I'll draw your attention to the globe-style lights. Those are very early, but they were converted to electricity. And that change was relatively common among the churches when they converted from oil to electricity. That happened, for example, at St. Mary's in Milton and St. Gabriel's in Titusville. You can see that the windows of this church are rectangular rather than lancet-shaped. Again, another departure that Grace Church takes from the classic Upjohn-style Carpenter Gothic. The next slide includes a detail of the church's truss work. It shows in the upper foreground a hammer beam. The hammer beam has been called the most spectacular endeavor of English medieval carpentry, which therefore made it something that was revived in the Gothic revival. This structural element, the hammer beam, is not only beautiful, but it allows the roof to span a greater width than any individual piece of timber. If we go back to the last slide, if that's possible, Rachel, we can see how the scissor trusses overhead here do not reach across the full width of the roof. Did you see that? Instead, they reach to the hammer beams, which function as braces to complete the job of supporting the roof. Now, the next church, the next image, is Holy Trinity in Fruitland Park. This is a beautiful shot of a beautiful church. But it shows that we're reaching some kind of outer limits of the Carpenter Gothic style, which in its purest expressions is relatively simple and unadorned. This is verging toward Queen Anne with Victorian embellishments. It does have some vertical board and batten, but it also has fish scale siding. It has horizontal lap siding. It has an entrance porch with barge board and columns. So on the whole, it's a little more active, a little more ornate than the classic Upjohn idiom. To orient you, Fruitland Park is north of Leesburg on 441. What is Fruitland Park today started in the 1880s as a colony of young English remainder men led by Grenville Chetwynd Stapleton, who housed them in a dormitory and taught them citrus cultivation, receiving their labor in return for his instruction. Holy Trinity was their, not surprisingly, English-style church. They built it in 1888. The next image is a 1909 photo of the same church taken from the side. And it shows in the foreground the church's lich gate, that's spelled L-Y-C-H, which was built in 1889. The lich gate still exists. It stands about 20 yards from the church, which is why it was not in Phil's photo. A lich gate was the traditional place where pallbearers rested and waited with the coffin, sheltered from the elements, before the clergyman came to them and accompanied them in the funeral procession to the burial site. This one is similar to the ones found in English churchyards and also to a limited extent in Australia, New Zealand, and even some in Scandinavia. It's one of only 2 lich gates in the entire state of Florida. The next shot is of the nave. And this shot does an excellent job of showing just how extensively wood is used in these churches. These walls, as you can see, are not plastered. Here you can see the convergence of upwardly pointing angles. You can also see groupings of three. Three is a number evocative of the Christian Trinity. So you have a triple window, you have three candlesticks, you have trusses that express triangular shapes. Triangles, of course, are three-pointed. This really looks like a miniature cathedral, but it's tiny. Still, it manages to give the illusion of much more height and volume that is actually present. I'm going to invite your attention to the flags for a moment. If you look at the flags on the right, those involve secular sovereignty, and they move from the altar in order of rank. You have the national flag first, then the state, then the Union Jack in light of the church's English heritage. Over on the left, you have the Episcopal Church, the Episcopal Church's flag, I should say, closest to the altar. The Episcopal flag, by the way, is partly based on the ancient flag of England, or the St. George's Cross, which dates to the Middle Ages. That flag, the St. George's Cross, is the third one in. It's the white field centered with a red cross, and you can see its similarity to the Episcopal flag right off the bat. The next image is the bishop's chair in the same church. The bishop's chair is often called the cathedra, which is the source of our word cathedral for the church that serves as the bishop's seat. This chair, like many in the Florida churches, is hand carved, and it stands in a typical position to one side of the choir, which is the physical area reserved for the singing choir. Choir means both a place in a church and means the group of singers. The next image is a new church, and this one is actually the one closest to the Winter Park Library. It's the Church of the Good Shepherd in Maitland. Many of you probably know its location, but if you go north on 1792 and take a left on Lake Avenue toward Eatonville, right away you bump over the railroad tracks, and this church comes very soon on the right. It's visible from the street, but it's a little hard to spot among the campus's other buildings, which of course include the 1967 modern church, well known, that was designed by Niels Schweitzer. In this picture, in your mind's eye, if you take away the covered walkway and then take away the expanded front steps and then take away the wheelchair ramp, you'll get a sense of the church's original look. And we'll see a period photo in a minute. This church was built in 1882 by Henry Benjamin Whipple, who was the first Episcopal bishop of Minnesota. And Henry Benjamin Whipple achieved worldwide fame in his lifetime as an advocate for the North American Indians. On their behalf, he advised President Lincoln and other U.S. presidents. Now, Bishop Whipple was a fellow bishop and a friend of Florida's Bishop Young. And Young probably helped, almost certainly helped, Whipple engage Charles Haight to design this church, and probably helped him engage the builder, who again was James McGuire. So this church, in effect, is a sister church to St. Mary's, Green Cove Springs, since the two share the same architect and the same builder. You can see that, like St. Mary's, it has triangular battens, or you could if you were closer, and it has ventilation panels, which unfortunately are very hard to see. You can see them, they're a little washed out, but you can see them, maybe that window furthest to the right, you can see the one below it. And finally, it's another example of an Episcopal church with red doors. The next image is an 1890 photo of the same church. You'll enjoy this one because it's so close to those of you who are in Winter Park or know Winter Park. This photo shows Bishop Whipple and his wife's winter home in the background. It's the only structure you can see on Lake Avenue in the background. Of course, it wasn't Lake Avenue then, it was just a dirt road. Notice all the newly orange tree saplings in front of the church. Also in the rear left, there's a man with a mule tending the grove. And the opening in the trees in the center of the background is where Lake Gem is. And you can see very well in this photograph that the church is elevated on brick piers. They have all sunk into the ground over time, but of course, this one had not sunk at all at this point. And finally, the last thing I'll point out is that the ventilation panels in this period photograph are very plainly visible. The next photograph is in the nave, showing the walls and ceiling looking toward the chancel. The chancel is partially express. It has walls narrower than the naves, but not a lower roof. The stained glass windows are by Charles Booth, a renowned glass artist who lived and worked in England and the US during the 19th century. This is a significant collection of Booth windows, probably the most significant in the Southeast United States. You'll also see just above the altar, as part of the woodwork, a large ornamental screen on the wall. That is the reredos, and in the next image we'll see a detail from the center of the reredos, and we can, there it is. And that's not original, but it is nevertheless early. And it is the infant Jesus with the Virgin Mary, with a haloed St. John looking on in adoration. Now, the last church begins with the next image, and it is St. Mark's in Palatka. We may have some viewers on from Palatka, I understand, so welcome. This church was built in Palatka by Palatka's civic leaders, including Judge Isaac Bronson, whose Palatka mansion has been preserved and is well known, and James Burt, who is sometimes called the original developer of Palatka. It was built in 1855. It is the only surviving antebellum Carpenter Gothic Episcopal church in Florida, which is to say it's the oldest of the Florida churches. It's also the only one designed personally by Richard Upjohn, as opposed to being designed by someone influenced by his pattern book. The original plans still exist, and they are housed, I believe, in the Smathers collection. So they, if anything unfortunate were to happen to this church, I suppose it could be rebuilt according to those plans. Now, there have been some changes to Upjohn's original design. The bell tower is early. It was added in 1874, about 20 years after the original church. Also, the nave was later widened with the addition of side aisles. The next image is a 1900 photograph of the church, and here, if we toggle back and forth for just a second to the last image, we can see how little the church has changed in the 120 years since the historic photograph was taken. And I mention that because the Florida climate is not exactly congenial to the survival of wooden structures, and it's amazing and a credit to these parishes that they have done such a good job of preservation. Of course, this church was actually built nearly a half century before the black and white photograph was taken. Consider this for a moment. When this church was built, American adventure seekers were still streaming west in the California gold rush. It was toward the end of the gold rush, but they were still headed out there. It was built in the year that Thoreau was publishing Walden. And in the year it was built, an ambitious young prairie lawyer named Abraham Lincoln was running, unsuccessfully as it turned out, for a seat in the US Senate. The next shot is the interior of St. Mark's. Notice again the excellent condition of the interior. If you were transferred magically to the interior of this church without seeing the exterior, you would have no reason to know that this was a church going on 170 years. I'll point out a few things. One is the tie rods going horizontally across the top of the nave. Those are those cables across the tops of the walls. Those were used in this church and some of the others to provide additional support for the roof, which tends to push the walls outward. Also, you have a good example here of windows with pointed or straight-lined tops rather than true Gothic curved tops. These windows, by the way, are from the Pittsburgh stained glass studios. They were ordered and donated by a member of the wealthy and influential Mellon family, Tom Mellon, who wintered in Palatka during its heyday when it was called the gem of the St. John's and rivaled Jacksonville in its importance on the river. It might be interesting to point out how a fragile stained glass window would travel to Florida. First, it was packed in wood crates with straw or similar material. Then it was shipped, in this case from Pittsburgh, by train to New York. Then it was carried by ocean-going steamboat down the coast to Savannah. Then it was transferred to a smaller steamboat that came down the Inside Passage, which was a route similar to today's Intracoastal Waterway, from Savannah, stopping at Darien in Georgia, Fernandina in Florida, before arriving in Jacksonville, then transferred to smaller steamboat, going up the St. John's, down as you look at the map, but up against the flow, to Palatka, and then by mule cart from the wharf to the church. The large bells of these churches were shipped the same way. The last image we'll be looking at tonight is the next one, and it's a baptismal font in the same church. It memorializes Elizabeth Mosley Houghton, whose name is inscribed in the top. She was the daughter and official hostess of William Dunn Mosley, who was the first governor of Florida as a state in 1845. After the expiration of his term as governor, Mosley and Elizabeth moved from the Monticello area east of Tallahassee, that is how they pronounce it there, to Palatka, where they became members of St. Mark's. Elizabeth Mosley Houghton was renowned for her devotion to the work of the church. Now, we'll conclude with a story that relates to this baptismal font. It is the successor to an earlier marble baptismal font that stood in the same place in this church. That earlier font was used by Union soldiers to cook in when they occupied this church and used it as a barracks during the Civil War when they came up the St. Johns River in gunboats and took control of Palatka. According to the church's history, their cooking left black stains in that earlier font, which is apparently the reason why it was replaced with this one. So that concludes the formal part of our presentation, which I hope you found interesting. So now I'll try to answer some of your questions. So Rachel, I'll hand it over to you.
There we go. All right. Thanks, guys. Now, everybody, if you want, go ahead and turn your cameras back on, since this is the kind of formal conclusion. I'm gonna go ahead and read off the questions that we did get. If you do have any other questions, go ahead and just go ahead and fill them in the chat. But I'm going to start at the very, very beginning. And let me see, let me get all the way to the top. Okay. You did go over this a little bit, Jonathan, but I am also curious. Dabney McKenzie asks, what is the range? And I'm assuming, Dabney, you mean the geographic range of these Gothic style churches. In what regions of the country can they be found? So yes, so what is the geographic range of these guys?
That is a great question, and I'm going to turn my camera off to make sure you have good audio. The answer is that it originated in the Northeast and it spread as the country expanded. Again, these were used on the frontier by the Episcopal denomination as their missionary priests went to the frontier. It spread to the Southeast, Florida, Texas, Georgia. There are quite a few in Alabama, where Dabney lives. And then it spread west. Bishop Whipple carried Upjohn's book with him as he traveled in Minnesota among settlers there and among the Native Americans. And there are churches in Minnesota that have been preserved to this day that clearly bear the Upjohn stamp. So you find them just about everywhere. There's some in Nova Scotia, designed by Frank Wills. I have, for reasons of time, not referred to too many other architects, but there were other important architects who spread this style. And Frank Wills, who was also English born, was one of them.
Okay, Janet Cardos says, hi, Rich and Jonathan. I was your docent / host both here at St. Mary's and more extensively at St. Margaret's, Hibernia. So hello, Janet. Thank you for coming tonight.
And Janet, if I can add my thanks, it is wonderful to have you, and many thanks to you for helping us. There was a period of time when St. Margaret's was closed, and thanks to Janet's help and the help of a few others, we were able to have it opened especially for us so that Phil could photograph it.
You're welcome.
Janet moved mountains to do that, and much of the preservation of that church in the present day is to her credit.
Thank you.
Rachel, I can't get our chat thing to come up. We wanted to type in a question and
Okay, so in that case, why don't you just go ahead and ask your question if you can't get the chat to come up, okay?
Okay. I'm Frank Gray, and my great-grandfather was Bishop Gray, and I was the Episcopal rector at St. John's in O'Galley, which was also changed into a more modern church, and my brother was at one time the Episcopal rector of Grace Church in Port Orange. What's that?
That was fun to see.
Yeah, so it was fun to see those churches. And I was told by one of the old timers at St. John's that part of the Carpenter Gothic ethos was that one could imagine Carpenter Gothic churches as turned upside down to represent boats or ships. And the legend was that St. John's in O'Galley might have been built by ship builders who did it in that way with the plans, but wanted the people to see sort of the Ark of Salvation turned upside down. And I don't know whether you had ever heard that before, Jonathan.
Yes, sir. And thank you for being with us. It's an honor. That is absolutely correct. Many of these churches were built by shipbuilders. The one in O'Galley, I believe, was. I know that James McGuire was a former shipbuilder. So 2 that we saw out of the 6 tonight were designed by an ex-shipbuilder. St. Mary's in Milton, which no less a critic than Frank Lloyd Wright, who could be excoriating in his remarks about architecture, called an architectural gem, was designed by a Norwegian-born shipbuilder. I could give other examples, but you suffice to say that you're absolutely right. Thank you.
Okay, our next question also comes from Dabney. And actually, if she didn't ask this, I was going to ask this, what was the wood that was used for the interiors?
We go into that in some detail in the book. The wood chiefly used was virgin pine, heart pine, dade pine. It's sometimes referred to in the southern, in some of the southern churches. There are many names for it, but Florida had large stands of virgin pine from which the heartwood was particularly dense. and it could be hammered when it was first felled and made into timber, but it hardens over time. The resin content is so high that once it hardens, even the scimitar mandibles of termites cannot cut it, and you can't even drive a nail into it today. The nail quickly folds in surrender if you try. So pine is the short answer, but the insides of some of the churches were embellished with cedar and cypress accents, and you find that at All Saints Church and Enterprise, which is a lovely church to see, and I mentioned because it's close to many of you.
Okay, Rick Kilby asked, Jonathan, can you tell me more about McGuire, who built the Green Cove Springs Church? Did he work with Henry Flagler or the FEC?
He did. He built virtually all of the great Flagler hotels, and I do mean all of them, in partnership with another builder. Again, I mentioned that he built the Seminole Hotel on Lake Osceola in Winter Park. He was considered so important by Flagler that he was asked to serve as a pallbearer at Flagler's funeral, and Flagler left him a considerable sum of money in his will in appreciation for what he did.
Old World Walls and Ceilings says, thank you for the delightful presentation. We were very curious about some of the interiors. Rick Kilby also asks, Phil, are any of these churches connected to your ancestors? And Jonathan, I'm sure that question extends to you too. Are you guys personally connected to any of these churches?
I'm afraid the answer is yes, although astonishingly, neither of us knew that when we started out. We are both born Episcopalians. We've known these churches at some level all our lives. They're in our blood. We are both native Winter Parkers. I'm a third generation native Winter Parker. Phil is at least a sixth generation Floridian. And yet we did not know that each of us had an ancestor who was directly involved with one of these churches. One of Phil's ancestors worked on the construction of the church over in Melbourne, and my paternal grandfather served for 9 months as the rector of the church in Fort Pierce, which since then has been preserved but was moved by barge up the Indian River to Satellite Beach, where it stands today. And I can see the Grays are nodding because they're well familiar with that move. Very famous, covered by Life magazine, the photographs were published in newspapers around the world when that move took place. It's described in detail with photographs in our book.
Rick also says, shout out to Enterprise. It's worth checking out the museum if you visit the town and go to Green Springs Park. Let's see, Rebecca Gallardo, I hope I'm saying that correctly. Rebecca Gallardo asks, which of all the Carpenter Gothic Florida churches is your favorite? And Phil, which is your favorite?
That's the second most common question that we get. In case you're curious, the most common question that we get, to our unceasing amazement, is what first got us interested in the churches. I don't think I can pick a favorite. Certainly St. Mary's Green Cove Springs is some kind of queen regnant of the St. John's. It is just fabulously preserved and speaks well for the style. I'm always loath to pick one out. For personal reasons, All Saints and Enterprise is a favorite of mine. It is very naive in the sense that the interior is fully exposed. It's just lovely to see. I could go on for various reasons to single out others, but by the time I got to 40, you would realize I was listing them all. There's a reason why you do a book on these churches. It's because you love them all. So Phil, how about you? I hope your mic is on.
It is.
I'm always partial to the one in Melbourne. because my great-grandfather built it, donated the money for it, donated the land, and has significant windows to the whole family in the church. So I'm
That
partial.
Holy
It's been
Trinity?
moved twice. It's been moved twice. It was on the other side of the river first, and then it was moved across the river in town, and then it was moved west of town to its final destination. But it's now used as a chapel.
Is that Holy Trinity downtown Melbourne?
Yes.
Yes, ma'am, it is.
Let's see.
The problem with it is it's been stuccoed on the outside, so it doesn't show its original wooden exterior. But in the inside is pristine to the Melbourne one. And I'm a 9th generation footage, more than 6.
Oh, I was looking at old information. Sorry.
Okay. Let's see. Our next question comes from Mr. Randy Clark, and he asks, when will your book be coming out, and how can we learn when it does?
Well, that's a good question. I know that the Winter Park Library, and our thanks to them, has promised that they will get 2 copies. So that would be one way to learn. It's going to be presented to publishing houses no earlier than June. Printing, particularly when photo illustrations in this quantity are involved, is an elaborate process, a costly process. So it may take a while. I'd be surprised if the book came out before next year.
The next one is from Miss Polly Schuster. And by the way, we are absolutely going to be crowing about it when this book eventually does come out. So just if you follow us on social media, believe you me, we will be the first to tell you when it comes out. Because the second I'm able to get a hold of it, I'm going to make sure as many other folks get a hold of it too. So our next, it's not really a question, but it's more of a statement from Miss Polly Schuster. She says, it was very interesting to hear about Hibernia because it was our first missionary to Titusville, Sandpoint, back in those days. This, let's see, describes his stay in Hibernia, down the St. John's, staying in Hibernia on his way to Titusville. In Hibernia, the missionary Edward McClure wrote that he had to sleep in an outhouse because there was no room in the hotel. So our next question is actually from Rick Kilby. He asked, can you tell us about the other church in Palatka?
Yes, I can, and it's covered just as extensively in the book as any other. The other church in Palatka is St. Mary's. It was originally named St. Philip's. It is a historic Black church that was formed as a mission to the African American community of Palatka by the members of St. Mark's. And it is on St. John Street, which used to be Lemon Street in Palatka. It is a jewel in its own right. It has been strangely overlooked, even in publications about traditionally Black churches in Florida. It is not included, for example, in the state's historic African American trail. And we're going to correct that by throwing a spotlight on it and by having uncovered some history that has not come to light earlier in any printed form. So we're delighted that chapter is as long as any other, and I hope just as informative and interesting as the others. It's I say that because the church has been badly overlooked, and again we'll straighten that out.
This is actually 2 more statements from Ms. Polly Schuster. She says, I'm a member of the founding family of St. Gabriel's, and I attend, so my family has been at St. Gabriel since 1888. Pretty sure that deserves at least a not just some applause. I'm pretty sure that's I'm almost positive that that's got to be some kind of world record. Got to be. But I also actually have some questions of my own. Since you mentioned the most common question that you get, what was it that got you interested in this research topic?
When I was, I was born a member of All Saints in Winter Park, so I can't remember a time. It's like being asked when you first knew your mother. I can't remember a time when I didn't know these churches. Of course, it was already the Ralph Adams Cram Church at that time, but the Maitland Church was not far away. When I was 16, I went with a friend on a trip on the St. Johns River in a small boat, and traveled up to Jacksonville, out to the Intracoastal Waterway, and came back down. And during that time, became aware of All Saints and Enterprise, and also St. Mary's in Green Cove Springs. And ever since, have just had an interest in where the churches came from, why they are where they are, why some were preserved, why some look a little different than others, why they have common traits. It was just sort of an abiding curiosity. I ran into, the first thing I did was take some photographs of the churches and took notes and referred to it as a project. Didn't dare call it a book yet, but then began writing a few years ago. I ran into Phil, whom I've known a long time, in the Winter Park post office, and asked him if he knew about some of the churches and might he have an interest in sitting down to talk about doing real photography for them. He said yes, he would. And suddenly we were talking about the churches, and it was like two brothers who've grown up in a closet in New York City and have developed a language of their own, because suddenly we're talking about Melbourne and Green Cove Springs and Melrose, and lots of communities that most Floridians don't even know about, Milton. And so we've been together ever since. We've had many a wonderful trip across the state and quite a few adventures, which I'd love to recount, but time doesn't permit. But we have been on top of these churches in aerial buckets and on ladders. We have been underneath them to find out if it was true, as church history claimed, that after a fire, they kept some of the boards and simply turned them over. And we went under the church to see if they were burned on the bottom side, and indeed they were. The story was true. In fact, there's no story that we've checked out about these churches that hasn't turned out to be true. So that is a pretty good record for keeping the church histories.
That is incredibly cool. I do have one question, or actually sort of a multi-part question for Phil. What type of camera do you use when you take these pictures? And Jonathan, you mentioned one of the windows where it specifically is facing west, and it clearly has direct light coming in through that particular window. So Phil, what is the best time of day to do this type of photography to get the best lighting behind these windows?
Well, my career was as a commercial photographer, and my specialty was architecture. So I was interested in these churches from an architectural standpoint from the beginning. In fact, as I traveled around Florida on jobs that didn't involve the churches, whenever I saw one, I would stop and photograph it for myself. And because I thought they were so unique with the architecture. And as for shooting windows, that is a trick there. You want light to come through them but you have to adjust the exposure so that you get a proper exposure, which means the borders outside the window go black, mainly because you've overexposed for the window. So I used high-end Nikon cameras and lenses throughout, whatever whatever best model was available at the time, I always upgraded. And then I also used large format occasionally, which is bigger film.
Okay, I don't think we have any other questions. So I think we're gonna wrap up this particular Parlor to Parlor. Thank you everyone for coming. Jonathan, Phil, are there any last statements you'd like to make?
Rachel, I'd just like to thank you and Rick in particular, and the Winter Park Library, and Casa Feliz. Thank you so much.
Thank y'all so much.
It was wonderful. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.